We're ready to start for the next session, a very exciting one as well. It is really a pleasure to have on stage Alexander Barkavi from the Council of Economic Policies based in Zurich, Mireille Martini from Finance Watch, and José Manuel Marquez from Banco de Mexico, Banco de España, sorry, I have my lapses with my collaborators over there, Banco de España. It's really a great pleasure. And without further ado, I give the floor to Mireille, who will moderate the session.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful. And I'm very happy to moderate this panel on central banks and climate change, because I'm really convinced that central banks are a key actor on the transition front. So central banks have got huge powers. They have the power to allocate credit. They have the power to create money. So they are not only very important to financial stability, they are also key to economic stability, and I would even say to economic development. And this has always been true, but it is even more true after 10 years of unconventional monetary policy. Can I recall that the combined balance sheet of the BOJ, the Fed, and the Eurosystem now stands at some $14 trillion, yeah? And also that central banks are now a major, if not the main holder of government securities in advanced economies. So central banks play a huge economic role, and the transition, I would say, is a huge project. I'd rather call it a project than a challenge, because we know how to tackle climate change. There is a transition path. I mean, there are many, but Nicholas Stern has developed the new climate economy model, which is designing a path to reach zero net carbon emissions by the end of the century. So we know how to tackle climate change, and we don't even need money, because it's not a matter of finding additional money, it's a matter of shifting money. It's a matter of shifting flows that are going to a carbon economy, carbon-intensive economy, to a low-carbon economy. So it's a huge economic project. So, and we are talking about new urbanization, new agriculture, new land use. Not maybe so much of electric cars, this is okay, but also how to make people spend much less time in their cars, which is a different matter. So we have a huge economic project, and we have a huge actor, the central banks. So of course, central banks are going to be central to the picture. They are going to be key. The good news is that central banks have started to address the climate transition matter. They have started, for instance, to measure or to assess the exposure of domestic financial systems to climate change. And they have also started supporting certain measures, like green bonds or like the voluntary disclosure measures recommended by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But there is also a debate, and that's what we are going to talk about today, about what more they could do, or what else they could do. Some people are talking about greening the quantitative easing framework. Some people are talking about greening the prudential regulation. There is a lot that can be done and discussed. So before giving the floor to the panelists, I would like to frame maybe globally the issue, giving three thoughts for food. Three thoughts, one about risk, one about risk for whom, and one about opportunity. So on risk, I think it was touched upon in one of the questions before. I would just like to mention that, in my view, there is a problem. We are in a world where we assess risk on the basis of probabilities. And I would just like to say that I'm not sure that climate change risks can be quantified using the current probabilistic frameworks, because we are using probabilities from the past, and we are facing something that has never occurred in the past. Climate change has occurred in the past, but never in 100 years. You know, in the past it was in many thousands, if not 10,000 years. Second issue, risk for whom? Just one question, are we talking about the risk to the financial system, which is a topic, or are we talking about the risks to human life on this planet as we know it, which may be a slightly different way to frame the question. And third and final question, I would like to say that the transition is a huge opportunity. If we price carbon at the right level, which is the tipping point levels, we make a huge wealth of real assets profitable, yes? And this wealth of real assets, of real profitable assets, which are all the projects that are not profitable now because carbon emissions, that is the negative externality, is not priced, then maybe we are going to create in the economy the amount of real assets that precisely we need for financial stability. So I'm sorry, I'm very talkative. This is the time to leave the floor to José Manuel from Banco de España, who is going to update us on what's going on transition in Banco de España.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks a lot for introduction. I work in the Bank of Spain, and as usual, from people coming from the central banks, the usual disclaimer apply. But in this case, this is for three reasons. One is the typical one, and is that central banks are a very hierarchical organization, and only people from the board members or the governor or the deputy governor speaks for the central bank. Then in this case, it's my personal opinions. The second one is because this is a very new and ongoing debate in the central banks. And at least in the case of the Bank of Spain, there is not a definite position, there's not a clear position yet. Then I will say my view of what are the role that the central bank could be playing on this issue of climate change. And the third reason is because I am the only representative from the central bank, because unfortunately my colleague from the Dutch central banks could not be here because of some incidents. And then I didn't want to share the responsibility to represent all central banks community. Saying that, I just want to give you an overview in this first intervention about what central banks can do, or what are the constraints that central banks face in order to deal with this climate change. Let me just give you some overview of what is my role in the Bank of Spain and what I'm dealing with these issues. That is, I head International Financial Market Division, and basically we have to identify what are the main changes on the financial markets and what are the main developments. Then at some moment, our colleague from the Treasury called us in order to go to a group on green finance that has been created under the auspices of the G20, with the presidents of China, that is the GFSG, and we go with them in order to advise them or to provide some advisory role in order of how to develop green bonds, green securitization, and how to introduce more greening on the banking balance sheet. Then this is basically our main role in this kind of discussion. After that, we begin to enter in this kind of issues and try to combine very skeptical people, that is the central bank community in general, that this climate change risk is important, and it's important to tackle from the financial sector. As Stiglitz mentioned before, usually the financial sector take into account short-term risks, and it's not very good in order to take into account long-term risk. And in the case of central bank, this medium-term, I didn't say that this is a long-term issue, are more difficult to take into account. And the third pillar that we are trying to develop is, acknowledge that this is an important risk, that is how this fits with our current mandate, with our current function and responsibility. Just let me give you an overview of what are our constraints and what is important in order to know what we can do. As Mireia mentioned before, that is, central banks have an increasingly power. In the last years, with the crisis, some central banks accumulate more and more powers. They have the financial stability responsibility, most of them. In the case of some central banks, like the Bank of England, accumulate more supervision and more coordination not only on the banking sector, but also on the insurance sector and on the market infrastructure. They had all these macroprudential policies, and they developed this quantitative easing, what implies that we have a big impact in a lot of financial markets. But central banks are non-elected institutions. This implies that the accountability in central banks is very important. And this implies that you have to fulfill with your objectives. It's true that we have, inside of the central banks, you always have some article or some reference to a general view of a lot of things that you have to take into account, but there is a primary objective in the case of the European central banks is the price stability. There is a primary objective that is the one that you have to fulfill that clearly you are complying with your policies. Then it's very important to take this into account in order to know what you can do and what you cannot do. That is, if you are doing something that clearly puts in risk this primary objective, it will be more difficult. The second constraint is that we are in Europe. In our case, we are part of the European mandate. If we think that we should change this mandate, if we think that we should introduce another thing more than the price stability, it's not only the responsibility of the Spanish government, it's also it's a European matter, and it should be decided on a European level with a very difficult negotiation and a very difficult discussion. In the case of the central banks, in most of the cases, we also have supervision and regulation responsibility. Then in this case, we are surrounded by all these European initiatives, and for us, it's very important this discussion from the high-level expert group, and in particular, what is the mandate or what is the recommendation that they are going to do for the European supervision authorities. And also, it's important things in very significant markets for the banking system, like, for example, the securitization system, some legislation from Europe that establishes that the securitization should provide some disclosure on the environmental risk is very important in order to take this into account for the banks and to improve the disclosure of this one. And also all this directive on no financial disclosures in order to try to comply with the task force from the FSB. The last part of the constraints that we have is the need of coordination with other bodies. In particular, the coordination with the government is very important. In particular for us, for example, in order to try to introduce, and we'll talk later about the possibilities that we have in order to develop a stress test or something similar inside of the banking system. To develop something similar to the stress test, we need to know what are the priorities of the governments, not only at the European level, but also at the national level. I give you some flavor. In the case of Spain, the real estate sector and the transport sector are very important in order to reduce the climate change. We are a country with not extreme weather conditions, but with very sharp changes between the winter and the summer. Then we use a lot the heating and we use a lot the air conditioning. Then we consume a lot. Then to be efficient on the housing sector could be an important driver of reduction in the emissions of carbon. And we have the orography that we have, and the transport sector is an important polluting sector. Then we have to identify what are not only the European level targets, but also what are the local targets in order to know what we should require to our banks and where the transition risk could come from. The second thing that we have to take into account is the coordination with all the financial regulation that came from the Treasury. in order to develop new markets that identify risks for the climate change. We can provide an advisory role. We can provide an advisory in order to issue sovereign green bonds, but we are not the one that could do it. Then we just can provide some advisory role to the Treasury. And the third one is to provide also some help in the cooperation strategy, as someone mentioned before. That is the initiatives in some emerging countries in order to improve and to fight against climate change is really important. Then we have some role on the comparison policy, but it's not the main role. The main role is in the governance side. And the last thing that we have to take into account is to have that dialogue with the private sector in order, in particular, to understand what could be, in order to understand what are the policies they are the development, in order to understand if they are not doing some greenwashing, and in order to understand what could be the problems that they will have with some of the implementation policies. Then these are the main framework where we are, and if you want, we can discuss later what are the main policies or the main initiatives that we can develop from our situation.
Okay, thank you very much, José Manuel. So a lot, obviously, is going on at Banco de España. Alexander, you have been working with several central banks and studying central bank policies for a while. Do you have any comments or reactions or things you want to share, particularly given what José Manuel has just exposed?
Yeah, sure, tons of comments. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. When we started CEP in 2012, and we told people that one of the areas we want to look at is monetary policy and sustainability, we actually got a lot of blank stares. And frequently also the question, what do these two themes have to do with each other? And I found that fascinating because we always felt, and I think increasingly feel, that it's unlikely that you have a policy field that moves trillions and that would have no impact on the environmental and social issues that we care about. And therefore, I think it's really encouraging to see how central banks have engaged over the last few years. It's great to have you here, José Manuel. And I think the direction generally that has been taken over these last few years is a good one. But also following up on what has been said before, I think this is far too slow. And it's completely misaligned with the urgency to address issues such as climate change and a broader sustainability agenda. And maybe with that as background, I'll just share a couple of observations, what we've seen happening over the last few years in terms of central bank engagement, and then a few thoughts on what we'd like to see moving forward, ideally already this year. So what we've seen is, in a first step, the recognition among central banks that climate change is a critical issue and that they have to engage. And we've already heard this morning about Governor Mark Carney giving this famous speech in 2015, and we've seen similar public voices going out on the topic, including, by the way, also the Deutsche Bundesbank back in November with an article in Die Zeit by a Bundesbank executive board member writing, the title was, "Central Banks Must Become Greener." So this is a good development, and it coincides with also increasing analysis from the sides of central banks, looking in particular, and that's also what you alluded to, José Manuel, what are the climate-related risks in our financial market? And central banks have initially looked at that more from a theoretical viewpoint. What are the channels through which these risks propagate into the financial market? And have more recently, and this is, by the way, one of the things that Guido would have been able to talk about because the DNB has most recently published a study actually quantifying the risks associated with climate in the Dutch financial market. We've also seen central banks engaging on the topic of disclosure and a bit on green bonds and international initiatives. But what I regret, what we haven't really seen, is central banks employing their policy toolkit to support a shift in capital flows, which is needed, both in their role as regulators, as well as in their role as decision makers on monetary policy. And I'd like to just share with you three very concrete things that I think should be on our agenda, and that I hope that central banks will take up moving forward. So the first one is on financial regulation, concretely on capital requirements. And there, as some of you may know, there are essentially two ways how to recalibrate capital requirements considering climate risks. I think one way is really worth exploring. I think the second way would be bad policy. And I'll get to the bad policy in a second after the one that I think would make sense. So what I think would make sense exploring is this idea that if there are climate risks in financial markets that are not adequately priced in, then it would make sense for capital requirements for high carbon assets to be higher. And that's an idea that is being discussed and that I think would also be aligned with the more general notion that having more capital in financial markets would be a sensible thing to do. The other alternative would be to say, let's reduce capital requirements on green loans. This is what Vice President Dombrovskis of the European Commission has in December said is the way that he would go. Several people, me included, think this is bad policy, and I hope it will drop off the agenda in the coming month. Second concrete example are the asset purchases of central banks. And let me relate that back to the previous session, where we learned that the European Investment Bank, over the last, I think, 5 years was the time frame, invested 90 billion euros into climate finance. The European Central Bank is currently investing 60 billion euro a month into financial markets. And I think it's really odd that we have no conversation around the question whether these 60 billion are aligned with the broader goal that the European Union has in terms of climate policy. I think we should have that conversation. And I'm not implying that 60 billion need to be shifted all towards climate-friendly investments. The market wouldn't have capacity for that. But maybe we could start with 1% of that investment being allocated towards greener sectors. And probably more importantly, maybe we should take a very close look at where these investments are currently misaligned with climate goals. And to give you a concrete example on that, the European Central Bank, since October 2014, has been investing into asset-backed securities based on car loans. And I don't think that is aligned with EU policy. Secondly, 40% of the corporate bonds that the ECB has been investing into are currently allocated to high-carbon sectors. Again, I doubt that this is aligned with the broader EU policy. And we should discuss that. Third and final example, the collateral frameworks that central banks use. So whenever a commercial bank refinances itself with the central bank, it will pledge collateral in exchange. The definition, what asset is eligible to be pledged in that transaction, and the definition to what extent the value of that asset can be used in that transaction and what the haircut is, has an immense impact on the price of that asset. Because obviously, if I hold an asset that I can pledge in transaction with the central bank, that makes it a much more attractive asset than if I can't pledge it. And again, I think we should have a conversation to what extent we can recalibrate collateral frameworks to also include these types of climate considerations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. So, very interesting because it shows many things can be done. It's not a matter of availability of tools. I think it's rather a matter of choosing a policy or knowing where the policy should be oriented. So maybe José Manuel, probably in a personal capacity, but also given your personal experience so far at Banco de España, what would you say in what Alexander just described? Maybe two things. First of all, what would be maybe advisable to do? And secondly, what is doable from a practical point of view?
Okay, thanks. Let me. I think that there are many other things that Central Bank could do, but we will enter later in the discussion. But just a quick reaction to your proposals regarding this capital impact factor, and this is my personal view, I insist. I think that your approach is right with some comment. That is, I think that it's clear that if you think that there are some risks that the market are not pricing well, you should take into account in a prudential view, and you should do some brown factor or brown concern about this one, because this is a risk that is not properly measured. Then you should be prudent with this one. Regarding the second alternative, that is to promote green bonds, I agree with you. That is, I think that is not a good strategy. Try to foster something from the regulatory side that could imply less protection for the risk. Here, I think that a good example is what happens with the Basel III regulation, when was first introduced, and with trade finance. It's a completely different topic, but basically trade finance are a very short-term finance that is provided in order to promote the exports. Then once that the Basel III was introduced, there was a penalization for this kind of loans, because they are very short-term, they are international, but they are fully collateralized. Then the people engaged in this one say, okay, you are penalizing one of the safest assets on the world, because even in any bank run, even in Argentina, every case of default, you never default on the trade assets, because this completely kills your country. The regulators say, okay, if this is so, show me the data that can prove this one. And the data, fortunately, didn't exist. The regulatory body didn't do nothing, because there is no evidence on that. The private sector mobilized, the World Association of Exchange of Chambers Commerce produced some report on that, take into account data, and provide that the default rate is lower. And the regulation was changed, and now they have a different treatment on the regulatory side. I think that in the case of the green bonds, it's exactly the same. If you develop market, and this is one thing that we can try to foster, you develop market when the pricing of green assets, if we are able to taxonomy this one or to classify properly this one, when you can see the evolution of the prices of the green assets and the prices of the other assets, you can see how they react, what is the volatility, what is the performance and the stress situation, because maybe the investors are more stable, and then under stress test and the stress situation, then they behave completely different than the other assets. Then you can go to the regulator and say, okay, you have to recognize this one. Then I think that your approach on this one is right. With the collateral framework, I think that is more or less the same. That this is true. We have to recognize what is the price of risk, but we have to have evidence of what is this risk in order to assess the collateral framework. And I have more discrepancy regarding with the quantitative easing. In this case, that is, this implies to use the monetary policy in order to allocate resources to one sector or another sector. It's true that this could not be compatible with the European targets, but up to now, the monetary policy has been defined in order to be neutral with the sector. That is, you never introduce any kind of bias from some sector, from some research or development sector, for the small and medium enterprise. That is, basically has been completely neutral. And part of the reason of this one is also because we are in a European body, we have several discussions with several members, and then it's very difficult to reach some consensus. But also because, as I mentioned before, because your target is price stability, then the allocation in different sectors is not clear how this will affect the price stability. Then it's very difficult to justify something that is in the second level target. If you clearly do not make clear that your primary target is not in danger. And if, for example, in the case of the quantitative easing programs, one of the reasons because this could be in danger is because there are not enough assets to acquire if you provide some kind of restriction to the broad asset. Then you can say, okay, you should to align these targets, but maybe to align these targets, you have only a small amount of bonds that you can acquire, and maybe you didn't have enough power in order to fulfill stimulate the credit in the economy. Sorry for being a bit longer.
So maybe before concluding, Alexander, do you want to share some thoughts on on the arguments that José Manuel just provided?
Yeah, just quickly. Two thoughts. First, in terms of the mandate, just so that we're all on the same page, the mandate of the European Central Bank is price stability as a primary objective, But then there's a second sentence in that mandate that says, without prejudice to the objective of price stability, the ECB shall support all other economic policies of the Union with a view to supporting the goals as listed in Article 3, which includes a high quality of the environment. So my interpretation of that is, as long as the ECB is not endangering its price stability objective, it is indeed required to align itself with the broader objectives of the EU. But I know we can have a long conversation on the mandate. More importantly, in my view, is that I think there's a strong case for the ECB to be consistent, because I find it very hard to picture a central bank, as is currently happening, going out to the commercial banking sector and saying, you guys have a risk in your portfolio that you're not accounting for. And we'd like you to do more on climate risk and to make sure that these are factored into your decision, but at the same time, not doing that itself. So I think as a very first step, let's put aside this idea of having the ECB investing into green bonds, etc., because I know these are not liquid markets. But I think as a minimal first step, let the ECB and other central banks do the same in terms of risk management and awareness that they are asking for from the commercial banks.
Thanks a lot, Alexander. So before we open the floor to questions, I think we're in a university here, and this is a place where I feel we can reinvent the world, or we can dream, or we can project ourselves into the future. Alexander, if you could choose, if you could make a wish for how, sorry, not Alexander, José Manuel. So for how central bank, how the bank, the policy of Banco de España will move, what will be maybe the 2 or 3 things that you would personally like to come and see going forward for the year ahead?
In this case, I don't want to be a dreamer. I want to be a bit more realistic. But I will guess that I would like that we take seriously the climate risk. This will imply that we have to change completely or dramatically our toolkit in order to do forecasts or do stress tests. Okay, this will imply that is our models basically are backward-looking, are national, have the time span, or they are thinking in order to do forecasts for 2 years. Then in order to tackle correctly with the climate change, you have to develop forward-looking, global, with a lot of spillovers and spillbacks, and really valid for a long term. This implies completely different modeling capacities and different people and different kind of researchers inside of the central bank. And yesterday's session on the models was, for me, really fascinating and very interesting. Then this implies a completely different shift in the staff or in the people that we're having. And the second wish is really to promote or to have financial markets where it's possible to obtain some price of the climate risk. And I think that this is not so complicated in some cases, and we are currently trying to push in 2 directions, but it's just in our advisory role. One is, for example, in the case of the covered bond, that as you know, is one of the most important parts on funding the real estate sector. And in this case, this should be relatively easy. That is, we have to revise our covered bond legislation because it's slightly different to the standards. But most of the houses has already a certificate about the energy efficiency. Then this is easy to implement, and this will imply that you have different markets, and you can begin to have this price of risk. And the other initiative that we are having is, for example, with the public authorities, with the regional governments, issues an ESG bond. We prefer, or we recommend, or we think that it will be better to have differentiated the energy part, the environmental part, and the social and governance part, because we think that there are different kinds of risks. You put everything together, it will be difficult for regulators, for financial market to really know if this is the climate change risk or is just a reputational risk that they are taking into account. I know that for the public authorities, it's better to have the flexibility of allocating the funds in different things. But in order to have a price of risk, this is not a good strategy from our perspective.
So thank you very much. When I hear you, I regret that I'm not a young researcher, maybe like some people in the room, because obviously there is so much to do. And I think it's going to start now. You know, it's a fantastic avenue for economic research, for data modeling, for taxonomy research, a huge new world, really. So, Alexander, what are your wishes for next year?
It's a long list. I'll just focus on three. So the first one is what I alluded to before, that central banks start doing the same as what they're asking commercial banks to do, namely to account for these type of risks on their balance sheet. Secondly, I would hope for the ECB to stop buying car loans. And thirdly, I would hope for the SNB to start engaging in this debate.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a nice program for 2018. Shall we take it on? So, do we have questions from the audience? Sorry, who is going to allocate the questions? So, please, maybe the lady at the back and then... Yeah, sorry, it's coming.
Okay, this question is a little bit out there, but I wanted to say that shareholders have pushed corporations to move forward. Pension holders are pushing, like, you know, I work at EPFL, I'm a researcher, and there's students that are pushing EPFL pension fund to divest and so on, and that's happening in the UK, all over Europe. But who is pushing the central banks to change? Where is the potential stakeholder that, I mean, I see yourselves, what is it called, where you're from? Oh, sorry, ECB? No, forgot. Anyway, you guys, you're out there doing your work. Alexander Barkawi from the Council on Economic Policies. But who else is out there? Who else is a stakeholder with, you know, the power to let's say, make this a big discussion, national discussion, something that can even be voted on in Switzerland? We have a potential to vote on things here. Maybe it's not the case in other countries, but where can we see the public, you know, people, students, regular people, engage in the discussion and push for some changes beyond what we see today with sort of business as usual of central banking?
Thank you very much. Shall I take the other question, sir? If you want to raise it now, and then we'll answer.
Yes, my name is Tony Crawford. I'm a Canadian. I was very pleased to be able to come here. My question on this topic is, has a North American perspective, because in the Trump era, we have a very clear message of America first. You hear it in the news all the time. And one of these, America first, is the complete deregulation of the financial sector and every other market sector that exists in America. All kinds of bills have been passed to actually implement deregulation and create things which are really, really scary. So I'm here, and I hear you talk, and I wonder if I should have comfort for the fact that you are talking the way you talk, and Trump is talking the way he talks. You might go to war.
Thank you very much. So maybe, Alexander, do you want to answer the question on the stakeholder? And maybe, José Manuel, you can take the question on what happens on the other side of the Atlantic.
Although I'll just quickly comment, you should not take comfort in any case. I think the discrepancy between what we'd like to see happening and what is happening in the US, but also here, is just too large for comfort. Coming back to the earlier question, I think, as always in fields where social change is driven, it's an ecosystem of different institutions and persons that are driving this change. And I think it starts by central bankers themselves like Jose Manuel and others, who are saying within their community, guys, this is something we need to take a look at. And I think this is probably the most important group of people that we should support as much as possible, because I think we're all aware that this is a very closely knit community with strong rules of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say and what catapults you out of the debate. So I think that's the key group to support. And in addition, obviously, it will take research, it takes academics, it takes commercial banks to engage, it really, and policymakers also. So in particular, if there is an open question on whether the mandate would allow central banks to engage on this, well, then let's make sure that question is answered by policymakers. So here in Switzerland, for example, there is currently a motion in Parliament that seeks to change the law for the Swiss National Bank and to make an explicit reference to sustainability in that law. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't know whether that is needed or whether one could argue, since the Swiss constitution has an overall sustainability article in there, that's actually enough to ask the Swiss National Bank to get onto this topic. But I'm just saying that it will take an ecosystem and much more people to move much faster.
Thank you very much. So,
yeah, on the first question, that is the one that could change the central banks institutionally, obviously, is in the case of Euro, is the European Parliament and the European Council. I think in most of the cases, the stakeholders of the central banks are the government. I think that the Swiss central bank is one exception. You have some private holders here. But in general, this is the institutional answer. But it's true what Alexander said, that is obviously to engage and to begin in this discussion is very important. In our case, this came from the G20 discussion, and obviously this will condition and this will introduce this discussion into the central bank community. And once the central bank community begins to discuss this more, dedicate more resources, and the resources of the central banks, once that identify one research target, could be very powerful. Then the idea is this one, to try to mobilize this one, but it's true that we are in a stage where there are more skeptical people than believers in the central banks. Regarding the second intervention about the United States, the regulation and all that is happening with Trump, I'm not very familiar with what's happening in the US. It's true that there has been some deregulation in the financial sector, but it's not so obvious that everything could be completely deregulated. And what is true is that this position is influencing the capacity of some international bodies in order to deal with this one. We are waiting to see if the climate change and the green finance is going to be part or not of the new presidency of the G20 with Argentina. And obviously one of the main difficulties is the position of some countries like US and Saudi Arabia on this position. But there are alternatives. That is, there are some initiatives, for example, from Bloomberg in order to move forward that the states and not the government could take part of this discussion and then take US into this discussion. And there are other forums where the possibility of blocking this discussion, like the G7 or other international groups, where this can be promoted and this can be discussed. Then the capacity of Trump is powerful, but it's not so powerful to stop everyone going in the same direction. Then I will not be so pessimistic.
Thank you very much. So I think that was useful. I think we have to answer the question which is top on the screen behind me. Speaking of bubbles, yesterday I saw that the Dow Jones passed 26,000 for the first time. So there is a choice for bubbles, I think. But we have this issue. If we promote the transition too fast, if we take certain measures too soon or too hard or whatever, is there a risk of green asset bubbles? So I think maybe we need to detail a little bit. I mean, an asset bubble is an undue and too fast rise in prices, then it can be due to excess supply or to the lack of demand. I'm thinking of the fact that, as I said, I'm personally convinced that the transition cannot be an opportunity when the economic regulation does not permit the emergence of enough low-carbon assets. Yes? Alexander, what do you feel about the risk of a bubble and the sensitivity or maybe the appetite of the financial markets for a bubble?
So definitely, I think there is a risk for financial bubbles in green. In fact, the study that I mentioned earlier by the Dutch Central Bank has that as one of 4 topics that it looks at. They are concerned about that. And I think it's something that we should all be concerned about, because my fear is that in the medium to long term, we'll be ill-served building this up and then having it crashed, and it will be to the detriment of what we want to achieve. I also think that we need to, and maybe this is taking us a bit on a tangent, but I think we should really sit down and think through what is the role of green bonds and what are the alternatives of getting climate considerations into financial markets. Because my feeling is that we need to ensure, the topic mainstream was mentioned on the panel earlier, that these considerations are being mainstreamed across all sectors, and that we don't get too focused on particular sectors where we can label something with green and then we sell bonds on that sectors or those projects. I think we really have to mainstream these considerations, and instead of a huge growth of green bonds, I think I would rather like to see a broad application of sustainability criteria across the entire corporate bond universe.
Thank you. José Manuel, is there sensitivity into the Banco de España about potential or possible green asset bubble?
I think that, now at the current moment, that when we see the prices of the bonds that are considered green, that is, they are now pricing similar levels to the other one, or with some small premium, then there's not this feeling. But I think that the Spanish experience on this topic is particularly relevant. That is, we have the previous administration of this government clearly bet for these clean energies and promote several initiatives. I didn't want to be critical with any kind of government, but basically the fact was a lot of initiatives has been introduced, a lot of subsidies have been provided very early in the moment. That is, we were one of the countries that first introduced a lot of subsidies for several initiatives on clean energy. And what happens is that the technology on this initiative is not mature still, and what happens is that some of these projects are not sustainable, or are sustainable only with some subsidy. Okay, there has been some revision on the law, there has been some changes, there are some conflicts, there are some litigation still pending. But the implication of all this, that has been to promote or to establish subsidies before the technology is very, very developed, is that now it's more difficult to combine the governments, more difficult to combine the top guys in the administrations about these kind of things. And you can mention, okay, the evidence is clear, the consensus is clear, the technology has developed a lot, but these people are very skeptical because we suffer a lot of losses, a lot of investment suffers a lot of losses. We develop a lot of projects that were no place, that has been a completely failed. Then we should be very careful a bit about this one because it has been important implications.
I see. So thank you very much. So maybe not so much risk of a green bubble, but we have to keep monitoring this question, of course. Is there any burning question in the audience? Yes, sir. Sorry, can I have the microphone again at the back of the room? Thank you.
Yes, I hope you don't mind me referring to your turn of phrase, burning question. Yesterday I spoke with regards to a concept in Canada where Canadian taxpayers sued the Minister of Finance for $1 trillion with respect to the case of the Bank of Canada being a public bank owned by the people, giving loans which are basically interest-free. And they saw the danger of that being taken away from them. Currently, this question is before Parliament with a request for a private member's bill to keep the Bank of Canada a public bank. And a Justice Russell, through the Supreme Court and the Federal Court of Canada, has engaged every taxpayer to complain to their members of Parliament to see that that bill is passed, for the reason that it cannot go to court. It will not be allowed in court. So it's a burning question, and I'm glad you asked me to put it forward. And I would like our panel to comment on the capability of a public bank versus a private bank being a central bank.
Forgive me if I kind of ducked the question, because I think, A, I'm not knowledgeable enough to answer it, and B, it would be a very long conversation. Maybe just a few thoughts. I think there are successful examples of different governance structures in central banking. Jose Manuel, you alluded to the fact that the Swiss National Bank, for example, is a listed company. Obviously, the government holds the majority, especially in decision-making. And the ECB has a completely different setup. So I'm not sure whether that is a dichotomy that is leading in one way or the other. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to accountability, processes, transparency, etc. And my gut feeling is you can probably structure these things with both forms of governance as legal forms.
I agree with Alexander. I think that the most important is the design of the accountability, transparency. This kind of thing are important. The structure of the central bank is different. It depends on historical reasons, on the federal structure. And sometimes it's difficult to change because of these sensibilities that are among regions, among countries. Then we have no evidence that this is really what is important. What is important is really what is your structure, what is your level of independence, how you report, what is your accountability, what is your transparency, how clear is the independence mandate and the guarantee of independence of the central banks.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time to close this panel. Thanks for everybody taking part. We can see that definitely central banks are now active and moving on the issue of the climate transition. Certainly the plan of the European Union that will be announced in a few weeks is going to raise also a lot of momentum for that. We have seen that there are many tools available. There's a huge potential for research. There is momentum going on. Again, my message would be, please let's all support it because we need to win the fight quickly. Thank you very much.